Okay, good morning all. So today's video is going to look at the poem After Apple Picking by Robert Frost. So just before we get into the poem, there's a huge amount of metaphor in this particular poem. So I want to look at a quote from Frost before we go into the poem in detail. So the quote from Frost reads, "Poetry provides the one permissible way of saying one thing and meaning another. People say, why don't you say what you mean? We never do that, do we? Being all of us too much poets, we like to talk in parables and in hints and in indirections." So I want you to think for 2 minutes, what do you think Frost meant when he said the above quotation, and do you agree with the idea he is putting forward here? Alright, so today's video is all about to read and understand the poem After Apple Picking. We're going to examine the use of metaphor in this poem, explore Frost's use of metaphor, and we want to draw comparisons possibly with some of the other poems that we've looked at from Frost. Now, if we go back to this quotation, what is Frost saying here? So he says that people often say to him, put the point to him, is why don't you just say what you mean? Okay, and this is a comment that you hear often about poetry. Why don't they just say what they mean? Why do they have to talk in this kind of roundabout way? But Frost's response is that actually humans, we never do that. No humans do that. We are never totally direct in our language. It is natural human speech to speak in metaphor. That we are all, at our hearts, everyone is a poet to some extent, and we like to talk in a more metaphorical way than we do in a directness. And there's issues around, not wanting to hurt feelings, protecting emotions, issues around what's considered rude, and a number of different conventions like that. But for Frost, what he's saying is that all humans like to talk in parables and hints and in indirections, and it's part of the beauty of our language and the beauty of our connection, our human connection, that we make the effort to do this. And there's a number of good reasons for why we do this, as I've already mentioned. Okay, so just keep that in mind when we're looking at this poem. This is what Frost believes about human language. Okay, and there's definitely a truth in there that we do speak in this kind of metaphorical and idiomatic way. Alright, so before we get into the poem, we also want to think about the title. So the title is After Apple Picking. Now, Frost is going to draw on some of our what we call cultural capital. And this is the idea that we have knowledge, or he expects us to have certain knowledge of different stories, okay, and knowledge of important stories from our culture in order to really appreciate this poem. So I want you to think, do you know any important cultural stories which involve the picking of apples? What might these stories suggest could be important themes in the poem? And is there anything you know about Frost's life which might be relevant to our reading of this particular poem, just based solely on the title After Apple Picking? Okay, so I'm going to suggest just pause the video here for 2 minutes and think about those questions. Alright, so important cultural stories which involve apple picking. And the main story that I'm trying to wanted you to think about here is the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Alright, so for most of you will be familiar with this story. This story is the story from the beginning of the Bible, that when God created humanity, he created Adam and then he created Eve from out of Adam's rib, but that's not really relevant. And they were living in basically a paradise called the Garden of Eden. And God gave them one major rule in this. He put an apple tree in the garden and he told them that they were not to eat the fruit of this tree. Now, that was the rule, and they followed it for a long time, but then one day as Eve was passing by the tree, the devil was disguised as a serpent in the tree and spoke to her and convinced her to pick one of the apples and eat it. Now this is what we call original sin. This is the first sin committed by humans against God. It's the first time that they broke one of his commandments, one of his instructions that he'd given. And God could not forgive this. God, seen this as the ultimate betrayal. So he came down and he basically said he threw Adam and Eve both out of the Garden of Eden, out of paradise, and they were to be punished for eternity for the crimes of having picked and eaten the apples from this tree. Okay, so themes there you can talk about, you might want to consider, is the idea of human imperfection. Okay, the Adam and Eve are going against orders, and they know they have a perfect life, and yet they do something that brings imperfection to that, okay, and ruins that paradise. Okay, so that is an idea that could come up later in this poem. We might also want to think in terms of Frost's life about the idea of the idea that he worked as a farmer in New England. So this kind of rural work of picking apples would have been a type of work that he would have been quite used to in that job. Okay, but remember, he's also a literary genius, a literary giant, even within his own time, and he's living very much two very different lives in that he's a poet, and that he loves literature and poetry, but he's also striving to be one with nature and be involved in rural and manual work, which is something that takes a huge amount of time and effort to complete. And just go back to that cultural capital, you might also want to think about the idea of poison apples, okay, and apples being a representation of something that, it is derived, I believe, from the story of Adam and Eve, the idea of poison apple, but the apple as being a danger to humanity. Okay, so if we look at the poem itself, after apple picking. My long two-pointed ladder sticking through a tree, toward heaven still, and there's a barrel that I didn't fill beside it, and there are maybe 2 or 3 apples I didn't pick upon some bough, but I am done with apple picking now. Essence of winter sleep is on the night, scent of apples I am drowsing off. I cannot rub the strangeness from my sight I got from looking through a pane of glass I skimmed this morning from the drinking draught and held against a world of hoary grass. It melted, and I let it fall and break. But I was well, upon my way to sleep before it fell, and I could tell what form my dreaming was about to take. Magnified apples appear and disappear, stem end and blossom end, and every fleck of russet showing clear. My instep arch not only keeps the ache, it keeps the pressure of a ladder round. I feel the ladder sway as the boughs bend, and I keep hearing from the cellar bin the rumbling sound of load on load of apples coming in. For I have had too much of apple picking. I am overtired of the great harvest I myself desired. There are 10,000 fruit to touch, cherish in hand, lift down and not let fall, for all that struck the earth, no matter if not bruised or spiked with stubble, went surely to the cider apple heap, as of no worth. One can see what will trouble the sleep of mine, whatever sleep it is. Were he not gone, the woodchuck could say whether it's like his long sleep as I describe its coming on, or just some human sleep. Okay, so we should try and think first impressions of this poem. What is the overriding emotion coming across in the poem? What imagery stands out most clearly? And do you think the poem may be about something other than the work of actual apple picking? Okay, so I'm going to flick back to the poem. I'm going to ask you to pause here for a few minutes and think about those questions and read through the poem yourself 2 or 3 times. You need to have a very, very good familiarity with these poems before going into deep analysis. Okay, so pause the video here now. Okay, so those questions. The first question we're looking at, what is the overriding emotion coming across in this poem? And it's quite clear the overriding emotion here is exhaustion or tiredness. Okay, he is despondent about his work and just overtired. Okay, so if you're going to be quoting from this poem, that line, "I am overtired of the great harvest I myself desired," is very much a line that stands out to us. I am overtired. That encapsulates a lot of what this poem is actually about. The imagery that stands out, you would probably talk about the imagery of the apples, the sound of the apples, the imagery of him working in the apple field. Okay, and we also want to look at, is there anything else this poem could be about other than just the actual physical apple picking? Now we know he does work in a rural setting and he has experience of this type of work. However, with Frost, even though a simple story nearly always has these extra layers, we may think about what other work is he doing that he might be metaphorically trying to talk about? So we might consider that, is he talking possibly about his own poetry? Okay, and we're going to come into this idea in a little bit towards the end of the video, but could he be talking, as we're going through, think about this also in the context of, is he talking about his work as a poet? Okay, so we go on to the first section. So, my long two-pointed ladder sticking through a tree, toward heaven still, and there's a barrel that I didn't fill beside it, and there may be 2 or 3 apples I didn't pick upon some bough. But I am done with apple picking now. Essence of winter's sleep is on the night, the scent of apples I am drowsing off. So what images are presented with in the opening lines of the poem? What tone does the poet establish? And what senses does the poet draw on in these lines? You also might want to think about the structure of the poem and the form of the poem, and what's going on here that might be somewhat different to what we usually expect from Frost. Okay, so again I'm going to say just pause here for 2 minutes and think about those questions. Okay, so the image that we're presented with at the start is an image of a man at work. Okay, but the work is not finished. Okay, and by the last line here, which is line 8 of the poem, we can see tiredness setting in. Right, so we start off with the two-pointed ladder sticking through a tree toward heaven still, and there's a barrel that I didn't fill. So he's been working quite hard, but he hasn't completed the work because the barrel is not full. So there's a sense of incompletion very much at the start of the poem. And there is the 2 or 3 apples upon the bough, so there's still work to be done. It's not that the work wasn't good enough to fill the barrel, it's just that he hasn't been able to complete all of it. The tone is very much one of exhaustion and feelings of inadequacy, maybe, that he hasn't completed the work. The senses that he's drawing on, so there are a number of senses come up throughout the poem. Here we have the image of the two-pointed ladder sticking up. We have the essence of winter sleep is on the night, and that is bringing in that kind of feeling of the evening feeling of the coolness and the tiredness that comes with the night falling. Okay, we also have the scent of apples, so a sweet scent of apples. Possibly there's a bitter sweetness to these apples, with the sweetness kind of relaxing and lulling him into tiredness. Okay, so we want to move on. We want to keep looking down and see. Oh, sorry, we said structure and form. Sorry, I didn't write that question down. With Frost, we've talked about how he is very much sticks to structures in his poem. He doesn't tend to rhyme, which is very strict structure, and he tends to write in iambic pentameter. Throughout this poem, what we're going to notice is that there is aspects of iambic pentameter in there. Okay? Some lines are written, and most of the poem is iambic, but he breaks the structure, okay, and he does actually fall back into a very basic kind of rhyme. Okay, so we see the still fill, the bow now, and then breaks the night off. It's breaking the with the night rhymes aside later on, but it's kind of an inconsistency sometimes in the rhyme scheme. Now, Frost, he doesn't usually rhyme, so why is he rhyming here, or why is he breaking the form and of the lines in terms of the iambic pentameter? This is very much a conscious decision and could be reflective of his tiredness. Okay, right? Perhaps the rhyming could be representative of kind of a fairy tale lullaby kind of story. We often use this kind of rhyme within stories of children to help them go to sleep. It could be something that he is seeing as, he's reverting back to basic rhyme because he's so tired. But definitely the iambic pentameter and the breaking of that would be representative of his exhaustion from his work. Okay, so some notes upon this first section of the poem. So the ladder being pointed towards heaven, we can say that this is an image and it shows that he's striving towards something. That's why he's putting that toward heaven still. He's still reaching for perfection, reaching for excellence, reaching for paradise, reaching for everything he wants. He wants to reach for or achieve something in his work. The work is not pointless, it is towards an end goal. Despite the aims, there is a sense that he is not achieving the goal, however, which is the barrel that he didn't fill, and he has stopped working with the job incomplete. He is so exhausted, and there is a sense of inadequacy in that he hasn't been able to complete the work. There is also a sense of job done with errors. okay, and mistakes that he is imperfect. He is making mistakes. Not that the work is just too much, it's also that there's imperfections within him. Okay, apples that I didn't pick upon some bough, and later on I'm going to look at him dropping the apples as well. So whilst he may strive for heaven, he feels inadequate to be able to achieve the paradise. The scent of the apples is reminiscent of the winter for the poet, and draws upon the poet's sense of nostalgia here. Okay, so he is very much looking at this era of his life and this kind of rural aspect in a very nostalgic way. And the poet is tired of his work, and his tiredness seems to be reflected by the nature around him. Okay, so when we're getting into winter, that's reflective of the tiredness and the sleep of the world. Apple picking takes place during autumn and into early winter, so it is reflective of his particular tiredness. There are arranged metaphorical images throughout the lines of the poem going on here. Okay, if we keep moving on then, the next section of the poem. I cannot rub the strangeness from my sight I got from looking through a pane of glass I skimmed this morning from the drinking throat, and held against a world of hoary grass. It melted, and I let it fall and break. But I was well, upon my way to sleep before it fell, and I could tell what form my dreaming was about to take. So a few questions to think about here. What do you think the strangeness he refers to is? What is the glass he speaks of? And what atmosphere do you feel is being established in these lines of the poem? Right, so again I'm going to ask you to pause the video here for 2 minutes and think about those questions, come up with your own opinions and ideas, come with your own understanding of the poem. Don't be totally reliant on what I'm about to tell you in a minute. Okay, so the strangeness that he's rubbing from his eyes, this is, there's a number of things we can look at here. Mainly what we're looking at is the idea of tiredness. That when we're overtired, when we're extremely tired, our visions can start to blur, or even if we're extremely tired, we may become somewhat hallucinate to some extent. And that is what he's trying to bring up here, is the strangeness of the overtiredness. He's trying to get rid of it, he's trying to rub it away, but he's so tired that it won't. He just can't get rid of it because he just needs to sleep and rest. This could, if we're looking at this in terms of being about his poetry, perhaps be a comment on his poetic vision, his poetic view of the world. Perhaps he finds it different and finds something strange in the way he's looking at the world at this time. The pane of glass here is very much on a strictly literal sense. What he's done is he's picked up a sheet of ice out of a drinking straw, and he's held it up. And you think about this yourself, we've all will have looked at through a pane of ice at some time, and you'll see how it blurs the world. So he's trying to help us imagine the blurriness of the overtiredness, but also the blurriness of his own vision and his own view of his work. He can't quite see as clearly as he once did. The atmosphere he is establishing here is one of almost confusion, but a deeper confusion. He's unhappy with his decisions and rethinking and reflecting upon his life, and perhaps questioning some of the bigger decisions he has made, including working in the apple field. And if we said this is about his poetry, is there something else going on there in terms of what he is discussing, what he's questioning about his work? Okay, so some points on this section, some annotations to keep down. The strangeness, the way he's viewing the world, perhaps this is simply a result of physical tiredness, or it could be related to his view of the world overall. Okay, perhaps he's going through somewhat of a crisis in terms of how he views the world around him. The pane of glass is made clear to be a sheet of ice, okay, so in a practical sense, and really what he's doing with that pane of glass or that sheet of ice is trying to show us that how blurry and how different, how he's looking at the world in a different way, and help us to relate to the uncertainty of his vision. The narrator becomes somewhat ambiguous towards the end of this section of the poem. However, it seems that the strangeness of his worldview affected him all the day, sleep before it fell. Okay, so this tiredness is not just at the end of the particular day. Okay, he uses that idea because people it's relatable to have it at the end of the day. Okay, especially with people he was working with, they would be very familiar in this rural setting of just being overtired from an incredibly difficult day of physical work on a farm. But for here, because he said that he picked up the pane of glass in the morning and he was well upon his way to sleep before the glass fell, so he was asleep already in the morning. It shows that this tiredness is something that's affecting him long term, and it's something that he is struggling with on a broader scale than just being tired at the end of a particular day. Okay? This is a more deep emotion, a deeper effect that being had upon him as a person. The strangeness may also be referencing the way in which he thinks back over his day now that he's asleep. So he could be looking at when he's going to sleep and he's thinking back over his day. Does he see it in a kind of strange way, and is he being somewhat, questioning the decisions during the day? Which is, we all do that when we're going to sleep. We reflect upon the days we've had. So he views it in an unclear way. He can't quite clearly see the day that he's gone through. Again, this may be represented as physical tiredness, or perhaps of his aging, though this poem is written when he's still quite young, I believe 1913. We are called upon to consider the nature of retrospection here, the strangeness with which we look back upon our lives. So we all know that when we look back, we retrospectively inspect our lives, we might see it in a different way to what actually occurred, and he is commenting here, perhaps asking us to think about that. So once again, Frost is taking a very simple idea within his poem and making very profound statements through it. Okay, so the next section we'll look at is a bit longer. Okay, magnified apples appear and disappear, stem end and blossom end, and every fleck of russet showing clear. My instep arch not only keeps the ache, it keeps the pressure of a ladder round. I feel the ladder sway as the boughs bend, and I keep hearing from the cellar bin the rumbling sound of load on load of apples coming in. For I have had too much of apple picking. I am overtired of the great harvest I myself desired. There were 10,000 fruit to touch, cherish in hand, lift down and not let fall. For all that struck the earth, no matter if not bruised or spiked with stubble, went surely to the cider apple heap as of no worth. So a few questions to think about here. What does the poet describe in the first 8 to 10 lines of this section? Can you be able to describe that in your own words? How is the poet feeling in the second half of this section of the poem? And can you relate to his sense of tiredness or exhaustion from his work? So again, just pause for 2 minutes and think about each of those questions. Okay, so in the first 8 to 10 lines here, he's given us a very clear image of the apples that he's been working with, and also of his physical labour. So we get this really clear magnified apples, and they're appearing and disappearing to him as he's going to sleep. He's been working so hard and such a same task over and over again, which is not for him it's not an intellectually challenging task. It's just it's a very repetitive task, going out and picking the apples. So he can't get the image of the apples out of his head. He's kind of been overtaken. And perhaps he could be saying that, his physical tiredness is affecting his literary work here. So, and he goes into a description. You can see the stem end, blossom end, you can see the russet, that's the colour of the apples. He can see every detail of them. It's so clear in his mind, but perhaps he can't actually escape from the apples. He also talks about the physical effect of the work on him. So his feet are still sore by inch of arch. It keeps the ache, and it feels the pressure. He's been working so hard, it's keeping the pressure of the ladder round within it. He can also hear, so we bring in a number of different senses here. We have the imagery, the vision of the apples. We have the feeling on his feet, and now we have here I keep hearing from the cider bin the rumbling sound. So we can hear the sound of the apples falling in. So what he's doing is he's trying to immerse us in his experience that he is going through here. In the second half poem, it is complete tiredness. He can't escape from the work that he's going through, right? And he's just overwhelmed by the amount of apples, so of load on load of apples coming in. So repetition there. You have the exaggeration, and there were 10,000 apples. Right, what's it? 1,000 is a million. He didn't take a million apples here. So there's very much, he's overcome by the amount of work he has to get done. And if you can probably, especially towards coming towards leaving cert, this idea of exhaustion and being overtired is something that you will have experienced at some point in your life. You may be experiencing it currently, and that is something that we should be able to relate to here. This is a very universal feeling we've all been through. So some notes upon this section of the poem. He begins to relive his experience of the apple picking. His recollection is almost hallucinatory. They appear and disappear. He seems to be in a dreamlike state. There's also vivid pressure of a ladder around. So it's specific, even though he's hallucinating, it's very specific ideas, and there's a range of senses coming in. The tiredness returns, and there's a sense of the poet being overloaded by his work. Tired not just physically but mentally and maybe emotionally tired. He cannot deal with this tired. He's very struggling to deal with this tiredness. He recognizes that he himself wanted to work. Right, he desired this harvest, but he may have been naive and not really known what he was getting himself in for, and now he is questioning why he made that decision. There is a paradox in the idea that he is overtired by things he desired. Okay, why? It's just pointing out his naivety, I suppose. I'm not sure if paradox would be the right word there. There's a clear Hyperborean description of how many apples there are. There's an exaggeration there. And by the end of the section, feels like he feels a lot of pressure from the need to make his work worthwhile. He wants to find something worthwhile in this work. He went out, and he doesn't enjoy rural work, but he wants to find a deeper meaning to it, and perhaps he is struggling to find that meaning with the repetitiveness of the apple picking. Right, so moving on to the last little section of the poem. One can see what will trouble the sleep of mine, whatever sleep it is. Were he not gone, the woodchuck could say whether it's like his long sleep, as I describe it coming on, or just some human sleep. So what do you think is going to trouble the poet's sleep? Why has he mentioned the woodchuck? And what do you think about the way in which the poem ends? Now, I suppose here and think about those for 2 minutes. Okay, so what do we think is troubling the poet's sleep? And it seems to be and there's a number of things. There's the overtiredness and the hallucinatory aspect of his brain can't switch off from the apples. There's the physical recollection of being with the apple, of the work at the ladder. All of that is going to affect his sleep. There's also the trouble of whether the work that he's doing is worthwhile, and has he made the right decision, and then questioning his decision to be involved with the apple picking. Yeah, he has a kind of a unique experience here amongst the people he will be working with, in that he has chosen this and he has the option to be a great literary figure rather than be out doing this kind of work, and he's maybe questioning, was this the right decision to take, to be picking apples and spending all of his time and effort on that. Why has he mentioned the woodchuck? There's bringing the idea of hibernation is just a natural, coming into winter, that he is tired and he needs to be refreshed from this. Okay, is it total exhaustion? Is it the effect of preparing for a long sleep? Or is this just some human, maybe he's just experiencing what it's really like to be humanly tired that he may not have experienced before? What do you think of the end of it? It is, it's a very inconclusive ending. Okay, he doesn't give us there's no resolution as such to the poem, and that is to do with his tiredness and trying to reflect to us the feeling of tiredness coming across here. He can't come to a coherent end. He can't figure out what to do, so he goes to sleep, but he's still in the same quandary of whether he's made the right decision or not. So here's a number of annotations just on this last section of the poem. Frost enigmatically states, one can see what will trouble, seeming to imply that it's obvious what he would dream of. However, for the reader it may not be that obvious. As I said, there's a few different things that could be going on. Is he worried about the work, worried about his life in general? Will he dream of something different? Are we asked to put our own emotions onto the character here? There's a sense of incompleteness and restlessness and a desire for more in the description of sleep. Okay, so throughout the poem it's always a need for more, need to achieve something, everything not being quite complete. There's a sense of confusion around what the poet wants. Does he want a long sleep like the woodchuck to simply go to sleep for the rest of the winter and ignore the work, or does he want some human sleep, brief sleep for rest, and then to get back to work? So it's a bit of confusion. He seems confused with himself of what he needs and what he wants. As with elsewhere in the poem, indeed, all of Frost's poetry, there's a strong focus on nature throughout this poem. The use of the woodchuck seems to imply an admiration for the animal and the way animals live their lives, and that they get the rest, so they work so hard all the year, but then they get the rest. Maybe as a human he doesn't feel like he is getting that reward. Maybe he feels that the work is unendless without the reward, such as animals get through hibernation. Okay, so a few notes just on this poem. The poem is unique in its form amongst Frost's poetry in that it breaks from strict structure, and it has inconsistent rhyming going through it, and that is probably reflective of his tiredness, or perhaps, as we said, is he questioning his decisions in poetry. Maybe he's trying out a new style here. The inconsistent rhyme and meter exhibits the extent of Frost's weariness. He blurs between controlled and pentameter. and lines of varied length in order to also create a sense of hallucinatory. The poem is basically iambic in form, and many lines are in iambic pentameter. It's just not consistent in the way you might expect from Frost. Though the imagery of the poem is vivid, again, it's back to being Frost. We're still with Frost. Even with the rhyme, it's still conversational, it's still approachable. There's nothing, anyone can read this poem. It's not a hugely complex on the surface level. There's a lot hidden underneath, in between the lines, and a lot we can delve into and figure out from the poem. But if you want to read it as a simple poem about apple picking, it can be read that way, and it's a beautiful poem as that. So Frost is always in his poetry looking to two audiences. He wants to speak to the working class that he grew up with, who maybe are not very highly educated, and he wants to give them the experience of beauty in poetry that they will be able to appreciate. And yet he is also challenging preconceptions, and he's challenging the poets of the time, and he's giving them something to think about and looking at society through a different lens. An interpretation, so there's quite a lot here, so you might want to pause. I'm going to read through this quite quickly because this video is a bit long, so you might want to pause and go through some of this and read through this in a bit more detail yourself. So the poem was written in 1913 when Frost was in England. Most difficulties of his life, so we know he had a very difficult life, a number of tragic deaths. These have not yet occurred. Okay, so you do need to keep poetry in the context of what aspect of where in the chronology of the poet's life they were written. Frost had lost his parents at this stage, and he had lost one child, but the deaths don't really come. They're not directly linked to the poem, doesn't seem. Maybe that they could link to emotional tiredness, but they're not at the same time as the writing of the poem. At the base level, the poem is about the tiredness felt at the end of the day of work. That is the basics of what the poem is about. Frost's labours has left him so tired they can't even seem to sleep. So if you've ever been really, really overtired, it can be hard to go to sleep because you're so tired. He's half awake and he's reliving the day he's just experienced. He's trying to go to sleep, and his brain keeps going over the day that's gone on. Writing for an everyday audience, the labourers of the time would have been very familiar with this feeling. Okay? Someone who works in the physical world, physical labour, would be very aware of the feeling of overtiredness. The job which Frost has taken on is imperfectly done, so he's striving for perfection but seems annoyed he can't achieve it. Perfection is constantly outside of his grasp. Fallen apples link to the story of Adam and Eve and the imperfection of mankind. Okay, so that's where one way you can link in that aspect of the cultural capital that we talked about at the start of Adam and Eve. It is all about striving for perfection, but humans not being able to achieve perfection. The poem is directly inspired by Frost's work as farmer in New Hampshire. He contemplates the difficulties of life he chose and is unsure whether to continue with this life. His uncertainty stems from the problem that he wanted the life of being a farmer and doesn't know if he should give up, as he's clearly exhausted. So should he stop being a farmer because it's so exhausting, or should he persist and keep going with the job, and it will eventually be rewarding? And there's a definite dissatisfaction in leaving the work and done. He doesn't like not completing the work, doesn't like having to do that, and that could be reflected in his poetry. Is he feeling that his poetry is not achieving what he wants it to achieve either? And is there an aspect of leaving poems undone? Are the 10,000 apples all the different poems that he wants to write, and he's unable to complete all of them, and that is that dissatisfaction. So he strives to present a depth of his fatigue through the language he uses. He creates images of the imagery of blurred vision and the hallucinatory dreamlike state. All of this is trying to exhibit the extreme tiredness he's going through. Some critics also believe that the poem may represent Frost's poetic works. We've talked a bit about this as we went through. His imagination is the pane of glass that is putting the strangeness on his side and allowing him to see the world in a different way. He strives for perfection in his work, but some poems do not live up to that perfection, and they are the apples that are falling and being bruised and being thrown away. He doesn't like having to do that, but he can't get them to the perfection he wants them to be. So they don't live up to standards and they're thrown away into the cider apple heap. The apple's not yet picked, maybe ideas he has ignored. Okay, so once he's left behind, the ideas he hasn't actually been, he just decided not to write about, or perhaps he hasn't been able to reach them, or perhaps he's going to come back to them. But there's a lot. Is he feeling overwhelmed by the work as a poet, as well as he's feeling overwhelmed by the work of apple picking?